here we go. So the global issue I'm looking at is how literature plays a role in shaping societal beliefs, and I'm going to do that through two works, The Stranger by Albert Camus and Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. In The Stranger, Camus is putting forth a new philosophy at the time in 1942 in France, the philosophy of existentialism. At a time when France was in dire need of new ways of thinking because of the Nazi and fascist takeover of the country during World War II. The novel, The Stranger, is a short novel in which the main character, Meursault, is ultimately arrested for a cold-blooded murder and convicted by the criminal justice system and then executed, and will be executed for his crime. And there's no doubt that he committed the crime. However, even though Meursault is an anti-hero, and not someone that we should aspire to be, Meursault is actually a character that is meant to be symbolic and representative. And what he represents is, in many ways, the absurdity of human life in a universe that's indifferent to us. So the reason our lives are absurd in the first place is because we believe that our lives are endowed with inherent meaning when they're not. The universe has no inherent meaning. And so when Meursault says nothing mattered, Camus is not using that to put forward a philosophy of nihilism. Instead, what he's saying is that the universe has no inherent meaning. But things do in fact matter. And we'll see that later in this passage at the end of the book, that for Meursault, many things did in fact matter, that he's not actually a nihilist. The other word choice that I already noted was this word absurd. The other thing that makes our lives absurd is the fact that we are going to die. In this passage, Camus repeats the word condemned 3 times. We are all condemned to die, and yet most of us live our lives as if we're going to live forever. And here in this passage, Meursault is able to accept the fact of his death. And the way that he's able to do that is through anger. He says that his anger for the chaplain who had just come in and spoken to him washed him clean, and that we should imagine him being happy. And he says at the end of the novel that he was ready to live it all again, just like his mother was. He reflects on his mother's death, which is one of the reasons he's executed, is because of how he behaved at his mother's funeral at the beginning of the novel. And he says he understands why, at the end of her life, she took a fiance and was ready to play it beginning again. And he was ready to live his life all over again. And what this shows us, the deeper meaning here, is that we are going to deal with unfair circumstances. The universe doesn't care about us. We're all going to die. It's unfair. Some of us will die too young. And even though Meursault is an anti-hero, he's a murderer, he's a sociopath in many ways, his death is unfair. Because the reason he's being executed is not because he killed the Arab. No one cares that he killed the Arab. He's being executed because he's different, because he's an outsider, because he's honest, because he won't lie. And therefore his death is in fact unfair. One of the other things Camus is doing in putting forth the philosophy of existentialism in the novel is he's rejecting existing ideologies, most notably the Catholic ideology that had dominated France for so long. And part of the reason he's doing that is because many Catholics collaborated with the fascists and the Nazis in France at the time. And he does this first by rejecting the chaplain and having Meursault explain why he's an atheist, why he doesn't believe in God. But also at the very end of the novel, we have an allusion to the execution of Jesus, where at the end of the novel, Meursault tells us, "For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone, I had only to wish that there be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they greet me with cries of hate." And earlier in the novel, Meursault had been referred to as the Antichrist. And after Camus published the novel, he said that Meursault is the Christ we deserve, meaning that society is so bad in the 1940s that this is the hero that we deserve, as people in the world. I don't think that Camus is saying that we should be like Meursault. Meursault, as I said, is not someone to aspire to be. But he does have qualities that we should aspire to. Number one, his honesty. But number two, in 1942, when Camus published this novel, he also published an essay called The Myth of Sisyphus. And in The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus tells us we should imagine, even though Sisyphus has been dealt a bad hand, we should imagine him being happy. We should imagine him as happy. And similarly, at the end of the novel, Meursault tells us, I am happy because the blind rage at the chaplain had washed him clean. And similarly, in the myth of Sisyphus, the reason that Sisyphus is happy is because he has anger and scorn for the gods. So we can use anger at the injustices we'll all experience to help us to accept our situation and enjoy our lives. One of the other important words in the passage is the word privileged, which he repeats 3 times. Why are we all privileged people even though we're condemned to die? Because life, no matter how difficult, is worth living and is enjoyable. There are things that we can enjoy while we're here, no matter how difficult the circumstances. And one of the things that Meursault certainly enjoyed was Marie. And that's why he makes reference to his mother beginning again by taking a fiancé. Earlier in this part of the novel, he had talked about the stones and looking for the face of Marie. And that's one of the many things that Meursault enjoyed while he was alive. He also talks, in this passage, there's a lot of imagery. Sounds of the countryside were drifting in. There's auditory imagery. Smells of night, earth, and salt air were cooling my temples. Olfactory imagery, visual imagery as well, indicating that life is worth living. Life is pleasurable, and we should take great pleasure in it because all we have is this life. There is no afterlife. So in the novel The Stranger, this passage exemplifies his philosophy of existentialism, which he and other French writers put forward during World War II in France, and that existentialism is a philosophy that took off primarily through literature. Another philosophy that has had a huge impact on post-war America is the philosophy of free market capitalism, exemplified in the novel Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. So in Atlas Shrugged, a much longer novel, about 1,000 pages longer than Camus' The Stranger, in this novel, Rand is putting forth the philosophy of objectivism, which at its core has the tenets of free market capitalism. So she's making an argument that the United States needs to get back to its libertarian roots through this novel and this passage. In the novel, which is deeply ironic throughout, Rand has her main characters, her protagonists are all industrialists and business owners who go on strike. So typically throughout history, the strikers have been the workers. She turns that on its head in this novel and has the industrialists go on strike. And one of the industrialists who will eventually go on strike is the speaker in this speech or monologue, Francisco d'Anconia. And in this scene, d'Anconia is at the wedding of James Taggart, one of the antagonists, and he overhears someone saying, "Money is the root of all evil." And in the speech, d'Anconia turns that on its head and says, no, money is the root of all good. And he gives a speech that's a warning to the antagonists who are at the wedding, saying, if you continue on the current path, you're headed towards destruction. And so the novel is very black and white. In fact, in the novel, the United States does become a dystopian socialist society where most people are near starvation, mass unemployment, etc. Whereas d'Anconia, Dagny Taggart, Hank Rearden, John Galt, and the other protagonists and heroes of the novel have created a secret utopian world in the state of Colorado outside the bounds of the collapsing United States. One of the first things that is important to note in the passage is he compares the antagonists and the socialists in the novel to savages. So the novel is in many ways a rant or an essay. It doesn't read like a typical novel. In a typical novel, the novelist would show us, as Camus did, through the characters, the ideology that you want to put forth. Instead, Rand has her characters just bluntly tell us, if you don't see the world the way we do, you're a savage and you're wrong, essentially. The novel is very black and white, and all of her characters are caricatures. There's no character development in the novel. The characters who are good throughout. They're essentially perfect in the eyes of Rand, and all the antagonists are bad, and they're bad throughout. They don't have any growth or improvement. Now, the one character who has some gray areas to him is d'Anconia, but this speech characterizes him as a protagonist. At this point in the novel, we weren't totally sure if he was good or evil, but giving this speech that basically is clearly putting forth her ideology indicates that he is in fact a protagonist. The comparison to the socialists as savages is important. This rant by d'Anconia here basically could come right out of Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. And a lot of Enlightenment philosophers like Adam Smith promoted their philosophy by looking at humans in the state of nature, basically saying most of human history has been horrible, and the only thing that's been good about it has been free market industrial capitalism. And that's the argument that D'Anconia is giving here, in part by saying anybody who's a socialist wants to go back to life in the state of nature, which was terrible. The novel is deeply ironic, but here the novel is unintentionally ironic because D'Anconia gives an argument that is ahistorical. He says the one country on earth that has not profited by slavery is the United States, when in fact, that's not true. Slavery was at the heart of the American economy in the 1700s and 1800s. And in fact, we fought a civil war over it that was the greatest mass casualty event in history because a lot of people wanted to extend slavery beyond its borders in the South. So in addition to being very black and white and being very ranting and preachy, this passage in the novel as a whole is often historically inaccurate, which is problematic when you're making an historical argument and trying to argue for a return to a libertarian ideology. Now, there are parts of the speech that are absolutely compelling. For instance, the emphasis on the phrase "to make money," which Rand notes is an American invention, and she does note some of the positive things about free trade. Generally speaking, countries that trade with each other don't go to war with each other. And so certainly that's a compelling argument that D'Anconia makes here, and it's an argument worthy of consideration. However, choosing to have your characters give 5-page speeches, or later in the novel, a 35-page speech, really is, number one, not entertaining for the reader, but number two, is not really the most successful way to put an ideology across. Yet, one has to also acknowledge Rand's ideology is probably the most important philosophy in post-war America. We've had several right-wing governments, starting with Ronald Reagan, into George W. Bush, and now into Donald Trump, where most of the people in the administrations have been heavily influenced by this novel. So compared to Camus, Rand has had a much greater impact on the world in the ways that her fiction have influenced reality. So literature doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by history, and how people react to literature as far as implementing those ideas politically and philosophically has major impacts on societies. So art is not something that is just over here. It's something that influences all of us in one way or another. All right, I went for 12 minutes and 45 seconds.